Every musical genre has its essentials, the tip of the iceberg as one might say, or in other words, artists that most music fans would probably be able to recognize a few songs from, even if they're from a genre they're not all that well versed in. Generally speaking, this tends to be a result of making significant contributions to a genre's development while simultaneously just writing some damn good songs. In most cases, these artists tend to have the approval of nearly everyone involved in their scene in some way or another, but they also usually develop extremely large cult fan bases that include music fans from all different varieties who might be able to connect with them a lot easier than some of their more niche contemporaries. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and my friends, this is a video I have been looking forward to making since the day I started this channel, the abridged history of one of the most quintessential punk bands to ever happen to music, the Dead Kennedys. As always, I'll be taking you all through the history of the band, from their beginnings in late 70s San Francisco, all the way to the end of their legendary 8-year run and beyond, as well as discussing their legacy and place in music today, and some of my personal thoughts towards them. Before we get started, I want to let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite DK songs, and if you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description below. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways!
California, Overallas, California, Overallas, Overallas, California, Overallas, California.
As I was saying a second ago, the story of the Dead Kennedys begins in the city of San Francisco, California in the year 1978. After watching an inspiring performance from the Los Angeles punk rock band The Weirdos at the Mabuhay Gardens Theater, a young guitarist by the name of Raymond Pepperell put out several ads in the paper and his local record stores in hopes of finding a few like-minded musicians. Ray would get his first response from a bass player named Jeffrey Lyle. Having recently moved to California from his hometown of Detroit, Michigan, Jeffrey was still largely unfamiliar with the local geography and confused the East Bay before Ray's name in the paper for a stage name and asked for East Bay Ray upon calling him. Although this was merely a common mistake at the time, Ray found he quite liked the ring to it and decided to roll with it as a stage name after the band's initial formation. The pair would also recruit vocalist Eric Reed Boucher and quickly got to work on writing up a set and trying out several drummers. During the tryout process, Ray took it upon himself to record the sessions each time they jammed with somebody new, and believe it or not, this is actually how the first DK demo came to be. The demo tape came together after a promising jam session with a drummer whose name has been long lost to the vaults, and Ray promptly used it to score the band their first show at the Mabuhay Gardens with the Offs, Negative Trend, and several other Bay Area punk bands of the era. However, as I implied, this mystery drummer would later inform the DK guys that he wouldn't be able to join the band, and to make matters even worse, he dropped this news on them smack dab in the middle of the booking process. In a pinch, the remaining three asked their friend Carlos Cadona to pose as their drummer for a photo requested by the Mabuhay Gardens, and it was just a week before the show that the band would officially secure a full-time drummer in Bruce Selsinger. After the whole thing went down, Carlos Cadona would also join them as a rhythm guitarist, filling out the original DK lineup to a 5-piece. With the two of them on board, the band quickly tightened up their set and headed on down to the Mabuhay Gardens on July 19th, 1978. Along with East Bay Ray, the other DK members would all take on stage names of their own. Jeffrey Lyle would take the name Klaus Fluoride, Carlos Cadona would become 6025, Bruce Selsinger would be Ted, and of course, Eric Reed Boucher would from then on be known as Jello Biafra. After their first show, the band almost instantaneously developed a following in the Bay Area, and also started a friendship with Mabuhay Gardens promoter Dirk Durkinson, who had helped the band initially get their first big push in the scene. I forgot to touch on when I was initially filming is that the Dead Kennedys would develop a reputation for their rather irreverent sense of humor and explicit lyrics, and they would often receive criticism from local news outlets regarding their band name as well. As a result, they sometimes performed under fake names such as the DKs, the Creamsicles, and even the Pink Twinkies on several occasions just to ensure that they wouldn't get removed from any of their shows. After a promising first year with the band, guitarist 6025 decided it was time for him to go, and he would resign from Dead Kennedys in March of 1979. This was certainly not about to slow the rest of the crew down, however, and after wishing their friend well, the guys quickly got to work on self-recording a 7-inch. The band recorded recorded 2 songs in Ray's basement studio setup and would release the EP in June of 1979 under the title California Über Alles. East Bay Ray would also take on the mixing duties, and according to him, this process took nearly 10 times as long as the initial recording. Along with its beloved title track, the 7-inch also included a B-side called The Man with the Dogs, which is another crunchy taste of that classic DK sound, and even this early on in their run, you could tell there was a lot more to this band than just punk rock. Both tracks draw heavily from surf music and rockabilly, and I think these external influences would play a huge role in helping DK stand out from the crowd. Jello, Biafra, and East Bay Ray would also co-found the independent label Alternative Tentacles, initially just for the release of the first DK 7-inch, but as I'm sure a lot of you guys probably know, Alternative Tentacles would go on to become one of the most significant labels in punk rock history. As for the actual songs on the 7-inch themselves, California Über Alles' famous title track is a cynical mockery of California's then governor Jerry Brown. The lyrics were a product of Jello Biafra's anti-hippie mindset and used as a means of poking fun at Jerry Brown's image as the hip and cool politician. And this, along with his boiling hatred for politicians and authority figures in general, would quickly become a staple of Dead Kennedys music. After pressing their 7-inches and various means of self-promotion, the band would then embark on an East Coast tour that consisted of several poorly attended shows. While the 7-inch had gotten the band a good amount of attention back home, it hadn't quite had the chance to make a splash in the Northeast yet, which put a serious damper on show attendance. But as any young band would, when they were contacted by a promoter who invited them to play in New York, the DK guys jumped at the opportunity to hop on a plane and play shows on the other side of the country. That said, the tour wasn't a complete failure, and even though their shows were pretty sparsely attended, they were still able to score themselves a few new fans. Not to mention, for a band that had just 2 songs out on record at this point, completing any tour on the other side of the country was a huge success, and especially during only their 2nd year as a band. That being said, the band definitely had set some expectations for themselves before heading out on the road, and when the tour didn't live up to what they'd been hoping for, they returned to the West Coast a little discouraged. After returning home, the band would fall into a temporary lull, and Jello Biafra came up with the rather outlandish idea of running for mayor of San Francisco. And despite it all beginning as something Jello and everyone else involved were only half serious about, it eventually did evolve into a proper political campaign. He of course wouldn't actually win the election, finishing in 4th place in the very end, but that didn't mean it was a complete loss for Jello or DK. While this whole escapade not only did that much more in making the Dead Kennedys a staple in music history, it also did worlds for making Jello Biafra one of the most significant figures in punk rock, and his knack for public speaking would also later get him invited to speak on several different TV programs over the years, including an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show in 1990. During the midst of Jello's various political endeavors, though, DK had of course remained active in their local scene, and upon the new year of 1980, things would start to heat up for them pretty quickly. The band had come in contact with a guy by the name of Bill Gilliam, who'd taken a managerial role in helping them get their name out across the pond in the United Kingdom. And after some help from Bill with promotion, it wouldn't be long until the Dead Kennedys started talking about getting a UK tour going on. But of course, they weren't about to fly all the way over there for a tour with just a single out. So Bill and his friend Chris did a little networking with the owner of Cherry Red Records, Ian McNay. And after hearing DK's promising 7-inch and a little persuasion from Bill and Chris, Ian decided he would give the band the green light and agreed to put out their debut full-length on his label. DK would then get to work on recording at Mobius Music Studios in San Francisco with the help of producer Oliver DeSico, and recording took place between the months of May and June of 1980. The record's official release then took place on September 12th of that year and was given the name Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables. The album featured 12 brand new songs along with a re-recording of California Über Alles and a cover of Elvis Presley's song Viva Las Vegas. The artwork chosen for the record was a photograph of several burning police cars taken at the White Night riots. For those of you who don't know, these riots took place in San Francisco in 1979 after City Supervisor Dan White murdered Mayor George Moscone and board member Harvey Milk. I'm not going to dive into this too much here as it is kind of off topic, but I do have to note that this also had an influence on Jello Biafra's political campaign, as he promised to build a statue of Dan White that citizens would be encouraged to vandalize. As for Fresh Fruit, however, before they unleashed this animal of an LP upon the world, DK started heating the kettle up with a single that featured the now classic track Holiday in Cambodia. The single's artwork continued the band's love affair with controversial political content, and it featured a photograph from the Thammasat University massacre in Thailand that pictured someone beating a hanging corpse with a chair. The actual vinyl record itself also featured a picture of former Cambodian dictator Salath Sar, otherwise known as Pol Pot, who I'm sure a lot of you probably know is referenced several times throughout the song. The single dropped in May of 1980 and also included the now famed B-side track Police Truck, which on a side note is actually my all-time favorite Dead Kennedys song. While it might seem a little excessive for me to be going on about this one particular song, as I'm sure anyone who'd consider themselves even a casual fan of the Dead Kennedys would agree on, is that this is not just any song. From a songwriting perspective, Holiday in Cambodia was objectively one of the most well-written tracks punk rock had ever produced up until this point, and to say it was a smash hit in the scene would be an understatement. If you ask me, I think it was this song that ensured DK weren't just another punk band in the public eye. They were gonna be a big deal for the genre, and not just in the immediate future, even if people didn't really realize it at the time. The Dead Kennedys also dropped the single Kill the Poor after Fresh Fruit's official release as a means of building further hype for the UK tour, and their promotional campaign overseas would antagonize a number of conservative British politicians when Ian McNay used an altered photograph of the Conservative Party convention with the words Kill the Poor pasted over it. The band would of course then embark on said highly anticipated UK tour, and would also play a few shows in Germany and France before heading back to the States for a hometown bash at the Mabuhay Gardens. DK were also invited to perform at the Bay Area Music Awards in March of 1980, and if you're not familiar, it was kind of a mini Grammys type of thing associated with a music magazine called BAM based out of San Francisco. During the show, the band stopped their performance of California Über to play the song Pull My Strings, whose lyrics presented a snarky, satirical criticism of the music industry. And interestingly enough, they'd never officially record that song, but the live performance from the award show would later appear on their compilation from 1987 called Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death. Also, if you've ever seen that one photo of the Dead Kennedys with the dollar signs painted on their shirts, it was actually taken right before this performance. The remainder of 1980 ran fairly steadily for the Dead Kennedys, as they of course kept up their presence in the American punk scene as well as their previously mentioned UK tour. But just as they were settling into the new year, the band would shortly find themselves in search of a new drummer. After a 2-year run with the band, Ted decided it was time for him to leave and pursue his education, but he did agree to help them find a replacement drummer, and he was able to put them in contact with a guy by the name of Darren Henley. Darren's skills behind the kit would quickly earn him the gig with DK, and I don't think I'd be the only one to say that he was definitely the more impactful drummer. In typical Dead Kennedys fashion, he also took on the stage name D.H. Peligro, and then after roughly a month of rigorous rehearsing to tighten up the set, the band shot back out on the road for a US tour in the late winter and early spring of 1981. And after a few months of introducing the US scene to their new drummer in a live setting, the band then returned home to San Francisco with plans for an 8-song EP. Recording sessions began in August of 1982, and sessions took place at Mobius Music Studios in San Francisco once again. Touring throughout the States in the early 80s had of course also exposed the DK guys to the faster, gruffer sounds that were starting to take over the punk scene, and especially in cities like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. through bands like Black Flag, Bad Brains, and Minor Threat. Enthused by these new sounds they heard, the Kennedys then put together a number of new, faster songs and even brought back several older ones as well with a little added speed. The faster tunes would also really give D.H. Peligro a chance to show off what he could do behind the drums, and I think this release is certainly part of the reason he's the more widely known drummer. After mixing and mastering, the EP was titled In God We Trust Incorporated and officially debuted in December of 1981 through alternative Tentacles. As I was getting at a second ago, a number of the tracks that made it onto the EP were actually sped up and intensified versions of songs the band already had written, but there were a couple of new additions to their repertoire, one of which was the iconic 63-second powerhouse Nazi Punk's Fuck Off, which I'm sure most of you guys probably know is a protest song written against the infiltration of neo-Nazis in the punk scene. Nazi Punk's Fuck Off would later be released on a single of its own that also included a free armband with that anti-Nazi logo on it that you'll see everywhere these days, and this particular 7-inch was instrumental in making that logo as famous as it is. DK would then of course resume their busy touring schedule once recording was complete for the new EP, and the band actually went on a short European tour prior to its release. They would then return home to the States for the official release show, which took place on New Year's Eve of 1981. While the release of In God We Trust Incorporated was of course warmly received by the punk scene, it was also the beginning of a new era for DK, and after several more shows throughout the US and Canada, the band returned to Mobius music once more in June of 1982. While many of the new tracks the band had been writing continued to draw influence from hardcore punk, several of them also drew inspiration from the post-punk genre that also emerged around this time through bands like Bauhaus and Joy Division. The new album was given the name Plastic Surgery Disasters and continued the band's love affair with political commentary and controversy, and the photograph they picked for the album artwork depicted the hand of a starving Ugandan child. Oddly enough, the same exact image had also been used by another San Francisco punk band called Society Dog on their EP Off the Leash the year prior. How exactly this came about and whether or not it was coincidental, I can't say for sure, but I've seen a number of flyers from back in the day that have both bands' names on them, so I can't imagine there was too much tension between the two of them, if any at all. The Dead Kennedys would then embark on a full US tour a few months before Plastic Surgery Disasters had its official release, which took place during the summer of 1982. The band would then return home for a break before kicking off a European tour in November, and this would also be the first official promotion for the new album, as its release also took place that same month. The tour would take the band to various different countries, including Germany, Denmark, Austria, and of course the United Kingdom again, and this would fill out the band's touring schedule for the remainder of 1982. DK would continue regularly touring for a few years following the release of Plastic Surgery Disasters, and during this time the band were able to gain a lot of attention for their label. Around the same time as the release of In God We Trust Incorporated, Alternative Tentacles also dropped a handful of EPs from noteworthy bands like Black Flag, DOA, and Flipper, as well as Jello Biafra's one-off side project, The Witch Trials. However, as DK's popularity within the scene continued to grow, their labels did the same amongst the diehards, and by the end of 1982, Alternative Tentacles had added releases from Bad Brains, TSOL, and 7 Seconds to their catalog, and would also become responsible for the debuts of both Husker Du and MDC. Alternative Tentacles have of course maintained a solid presence over the years, dropping releases from many more noteworthy bands including Amoebics, Nausea, The Butthole Surfers, F-, SNFU, and The Melvins, and there are tons more kick-ass bands that have and still are working with the label to this day. While we're on this subject, I do of course also have to mention the lawsuit in 2000 that resulted in them losing the rights to most of the Dead Kennedys stuff, but I'll be diving into that a little later on in this video. All of that being said though, Alternative Tentacles is a subject I think should have a video of its own, but since it is the label the DK guys started during their original run and put out almost all of their releases, this video would not be complete without at least a brief rundown. The band would enter the studio again in the spring of 1985 and began recording their third full-length album in May. Recording sessions spanned all the way into the mid-summer, and this time they chose to record at Hyde Street Studios instead of Mobius Music. This album exposed fans to a more experimental side of the Dead Kennedys, dialing back the hardcore influence they'd showcased on their previous two releases and shifting towards a more progressive and even jazz-influenced sound. The record is full of these almost spacey, atmospheric guitar parts from East Bay Ray, partially due to his interest in spaghetti western soundtracks at the time. Klaus Fluoride also delivered a lot of groovier, smoother bass parts similar to those from the Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables era, and D.H. Peligro also toyed around with some more progressive drumming in contrast to the fast punk grooves he'd largely limited himself to on the past two releases. The band would also recruit session musicians for trumpet and keyboard parts for the songs MTV, Get Off the Air, and A Growing Boy Needs His Lunch. Then finally, after what was probably a super intense writing, recording, and mixing process, DK officially released the 10-song LP under the name Frankenchrist in October of 1985 via Alternative Tentacles. In typical Dead Kennedys fashion, the album sparked a decent amount of controversy with conservative America upon its release, and most notably due to its inclusion of H.R. Giger's Landscape XX, or otherwise known as Penis Landscape, as an insert poster. I absolutely cannot show this art piece in the video, so if you're really dying to see it in all its graphic detail, you can go ahead and Google it, and if not, well, you can use your imagination then. The controversy surrounding the insert actually got the band charged with violating California's penal code, and the album would get banned from numerous record stores countrywide. And if all of that wasn't enough, the album's cover art was a picture of 4 members of the Shriners International Masonic Society driving miniature cars at a parade, and the guys photographed in the picture actually tried to sue the band for using them on their album art. In addition to the lawsuits, the band was also becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the state of punk and hardcore, as they felt the scene was overrun with macho attitudes and violent behavior. And on February 21st of 1986, the Dead Kennedys played their final show at the Freeborn Hall in Davis, California. The band would, however, continue to work on music for a short time after, and prior to splitting up, they released their fourth and final full-length record, Bedtime for Democracy, in November of 1986. The record contained a whopping 20 brand new tracks from DK, along with a cover of David Allan Coe's song, Take This Job and Shove It, and was recorded at 2 separate studios between the months of April and July. The finished product presents an almost retrospective array of songs ranging from fast hardcore numbers to more experimental tracks throughout its lengthy run. Although Bedtime for Democracy would be the final studio album from DK, they would also release a compilation by the name of Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death in June of 1987. The comp consisted mainly of B-sides, live recordings, and alternate versions of previously released songs. However, it would include one previously unreleased studio recording by the name of Buzz Bomb from Pasadena that features Jello Biafra performing as some sort of crazy old lady or something. The only other previously unreleased track on the comp was a live recording of that song Pull My Strings that the band had performed at the Bay Area Music Awards. But if you're watching this video, then I'm sure you're aware that this was most certainly not the end for the Dead Kennedys and their shenanigans. Although their run as a band was officially over, the DK guys would still maintain presences of their own throughout various forms of media. East Bay Ray, Klaus Fluoride, and DH Peligro would continue on into different musical endeavors, including Fluoride's solo album The Light Is Flickering, Ray's band's Scrapyard and Jumbo Shrimp, and DH's brief stint as the drummer for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Jello Biafra, on the other hand, would dive more into his philosophical side, releasing numerous spoken word albums and being invited to speak on various televised political discussions. However, he would continue doing music with an industrial side project by the name of Lard that he put together with Al Jorgensen from Ministry. So even though the Dead Kennedys weren't performing as a group anymore, I think these different endeavors they all had helped keep their legacy alive, especially since their work with DK would often get cited in discussions about their current projects. The next big chapter for the Dead Kennedys band itself wouldn't come until the late 90s when DH, Ray, and Klaus came into conflict with Jello Biafra over his failure to pay them royalties from alternative Tentacles. While this was later revealed to be a mistake on Biafra's end, the other members continued to press charges as he'd failed to inform them of the error, and they believed he would have tried to use the money against them. The issue would then be taken to court and resulted in Biafra and alternative Tentacles both getting charged with malice, oppression, and fraud. Jello was then forced to pass over the rights to the vast majority of the Dead Kennedys' music to the Decay Music Partnership, and the judges also came to believe that he lacked credibility in the actual songwriting and that credits were due to the entire band. This would become a topic of discussion all over the underground music world, and it was later speculated that the actual fraud on Biafra's end was that he was paying himself and other members of DK less than he was paying other bands on the label for their record sales. However, details on this matter remain fairly scarce and generally biased one way or the other. All of this would spark further conflict between the group and Jello Biafra, with Biafra claiming that East Bay Ray had never been satisfied with any of the payments he'd received from alternative Tentacles, and he would also accuse Ray and the other guys of trying to license Holiday in Cambodia for a Levi Jeans commercial. However, Ray, Klaus, and DH would deny this ever happening. Further tensions between the former DK guys would emerge when Ray, DH, and Fluoride invited Biafra to join them for a reunion as an attempt to bury the hatchet after all the lawsuits and accusations. This would of course only push Biafra further away, and he would criticize his former bandmates by calling the reunion a cash grab and openly discourage fans from buying any of the DK reissues or live albums that they would release going forward. The other three members would of course still follow through with their plan for a Dead Kennedys reunion by recruiting former Dr. No vocalist Brandon Cruz, and he's only one of several different singers the band has toured with since their reunion. Jello Biafra would also pursue several musical endeavors of his own throughout the 21st century, and he started the band Jello Biafra and the Guantanamo School of Medicine in 2008 that he's still performing with to this day. He would also collaborate with the Melvins in 2004 on a reworked version of California Über by the name of Those Dumb Punk Kids Will Buy Anything, through which he criticized his former bandmates in their reunion. So this more or less brings us up to the current day in DK history. I could of course go through their catalog of live albums and reissues that they've done since their reunion, but I think it's a lot more important to discuss not only their massive legacy, but also the extremely significant mark they left on music forever. Something that I think the Dead Kennedys don't get a whole lot of credit for before is that they really normalized the concept of musical progression and experimentation in the punk rock world. I don't think anyone would try and deny that the genre has certainly come a long way from its beginnings as a simplistic four-chord reaction against prog in the late 70s, but I firmly believe that it would never have come this far if not for the Dead Kennedys. Even by as late as the mid-80s, I would say Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables was still years ahead of its time in terms of musicality. DK were doing things like octave riffs and groovy bass intros as early as 1979, and these were songwriting concepts that, save for a handful of bands from Orange County, largely would not be revisited until the very end of the 80s when bands like Bad Religion and NoFX started to find their footing. The band also had a very strong grasp on the concept of song structure and hook writing, and while they certainly had contemporaries like the Misfits, Cock Sparrer, and the Buzzcocks that presented a more jangly take on punk at the time, all of these bands were still vastly more simplistic in comparison, and I think that DK's more ambitious composition style helped their skills with songwriting shine through a lot more, and different sections of songs feel a lot more emphasized. Just think about it for a second. Compare a song like Last Caress by the Misfits or Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones to Holiday in Cambodia. The difference is night and day. You can really hear when that chorus kicks in and the verses are spread apart by these equally as engaging instrumental interludes. And that's another thing. DK did worlds when it came to bringing the concept of riffs and guitar solos into punk rock. While they maybe weren't the only ones who were toying around with this concept when they first came out, I for one think they were the instrumental band in solidifying it with the genre as a whole. Honestly, listen to early material from famously riffy bands like the Descendants, RKL, or Suicidal Tendencies. I think it's pretty obviously the Dead Kennedys at work there. And finally, I think DK also played a really important role in intertwining the presence of forward thinking and equality in the punk rock world. This sort of thing did, of course, exist before they came on the scene, but I think they were one of the most important bands to establish it as a significant pillar of punk. I definitely don't think you have to agree with everything Jello Biafra would say back in the 80s, nor do I believe you need to subscribe to any kind of radical left political stance to understand punk music and culture, but when it comes to things that are more concerned with morality, like standing against racism, homophobia, sexism, etc., it's honestly an essential to understanding it, and I think DK actually played a huge role in ensuring this lasted in the scene long term. As far as I know, they were also the first band to explicitly condemn Nazism in the scene, and a lot of the bands that they would later put on through alternative Tentacles would further solidify these types of progressive ideals in the punk world. Plus, the fact that the Dead Kennedys were just as competent on the musical side of things probably made it a little easier for them to get their message out there than some of their contemporaries on this front like Crass or MDC. And just like always, I'll be leaving you all with some of my thoughts on Dead Kennedys' music and legacy. So I've been a fan of the Dead Kennedys pretty much since I first got into punk rock when I was 13. The riffy, surfy guitar playing is initially what attracted me to their music, but as time went on, I really came to love the whole package. As much as I loved DK growing up though, I have to say researching this video and really doing the deep dive into their music has honestly made me like them even more. I've really come to appreciate just how crucial they are to the development of punk rock, and I think it's pretty safe to say that a lot of my favorite bands like Strung Out or a Wilhelm Scream probably wouldn't exist the same way if it weren't for DK. And I mean this in the best way possible, but I kind of think of the Dead Kennedys as almost the Metallica of punk rock in a sense. Both bands had only a handful of super significant releases that came out over the course of roughly a 10-year run, but everything either of them put out during that first decade was absolutely groundbreaking from both a musical and cultural standpoint in their respective scenes. And even though most modern metal sounds absolutely nothing like any of the first 5 Metallica records, they were one of the first bands to give the genre the huge leap of faith it needed to enter its next era, and the Dead Kennedys fill that role pretty much identically in the punk world. The genre has of course come a long way since their last studio release in 1986, but everything they brought to punk during the early to mid 80s, whether it be a musical or ideological thing, really set the stage for bands like NoFX, Bad Religion, and Rancid to reach as far as they did in the next decade. So I think that about sums up our little crash course here on the Dead Kennedys. Like I was saying, I had a lot of fun researching this, and I can't wait to talk about more legacy bands like them here on the channel. I'd also be interested in doing a video on the different escapades of Jello Biafra, so let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd like to see. But anyways, that's enough from me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite Dead Kennedys song or album? Do you think they're just as important to punk rock as I do, or do you disagree? Either way, let me know in the comments below. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.